Welcome to the world of stories. Here you will find the most exciting and engaging plots about the challenges and secrets of millionaire families. Love, power, betrayals, and second chances. Each story is a dive into the fascinating universe of the rich and powerful. Prepare to be moved, surprised.
The city was alive, a symphony of honking cars, the murmurs of busy streets, and the flicker of neon lights cutting through the evening haze. Jackson Harper stood at the top of his empire, quite literally. From the glass-paneled balcony of his penthouse apartment in Manhattan, he surveyed the city that had once been nothing but a dream. Now, it was his playground. The Harper name was plastered on skyscrapers, luxury hotels, and magazines showcasing the most influential people under 40. At 37, Jackson was the epitome of power and success, a self-made billionaire with the world at his feet. Tonight, the world seemed especially radiant. His fiancée, Elena Grayson, was hosting a lavish party downstairs in honor of Jackson's birthday. Guests were milling about, sipping champagne that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and mingling with the crème de la crème of New York society. Yet, despite the celebration, Jackson felt a faint unease creeping in. He chalked it up to exhaustion. Building an empire came with sacrifices, after all. A knock on the glass door pulled him from his thoughts. Trevor Reed, his best friend and business partner, entered with his usual confident grin. Trevor was everything Jackson wasn't: charismatic, laid-back, and always the life of the party. But their partnership had worked for over a decade, with Trevor handling PR and networking while Jackson focused on strategy and operations. "Hey, birthday boy," Trevor greeted, holding out a glass of whiskey. "Why are you hiding up here while your guests are busy toasting to you downstairs?" Jackson smirked and accepted the drink. "Just needed a moment to breathe." Trevor leaned against the railing. "Well, enjoy it while it lasts. Tomorrow's going to be busy. I lined up a meeting with the investors from Dubai. They're ready to put down $500 million for the expansion in Asia." Jackson raised an eyebrow. $500 million? Impressive. "You know me," Trevor said with a wink. "I always deliver." For a moment, Jackson allowed himself to relax. Trevor's confidence had always been infectious. But something in his friend's tone, a subtle edge, made Jackson's unease resurface. The next morning, that unease exploded into full-blown chaos. Jackson was awakened not by the soft chime of his alarm but by the relentless buzz of his phone. Groggy, he reached for it, only to find dozens of missed calls and messages from his legal team. Before he could process what was happening, his assistant burst into the room, pale and visibly shaken. "Mr. Harper, we have a problem," she said, handing him a tablet. Jackson's stomach dropped as he scanned the headlines. Billionaire scandal. Harper hotels under federal investigation for fraud. He sat up abruptly, his mind racing. "What the hell is this?" "It's all over the news," she said. "The FBI raided the corporate office this morning. They're saying funds were embezzled." "That's impossible," Jackson snapped, his voice sharp. "This has to be some kind of mistake." But as the hours passed, the situation only grew worse. By midday, he was meeting with his legal team in his office, the blinds drawn to block out the prying eyes of the press camped outside. "Jackson," one of his lawyers began, his tone grim. "The evidence is damning. Someone funneled millions out of the company's accounts over the past 3 years. The trail leads back to Trevor." Jackson felt like the air had been knocked out of him. "Trevor," he repeated, disbelief etched into his face. That's not possible." The lawyer hesitated. "We have emails, signed authorizations, and offshore accounts linked to both his name and—" He paused, his gaze heavy. "Yours." Jackson shot to his feet. "Are you suggesting I had something to do with this?" "No, of course not," the lawyer said quickly. "But the authorities might not be so generous. Your name is on the company's paperwork. As CEO, you're liable." The next few days passed in a blur of interrogations, press conferences, and desperate attempts to salvage what remained of his reputation. But the damage was done. Clients pulled out of deals. Investors abandoned ship. And Trevor? He was nowhere to be found. Jackson's fiancée, Elena, initially seemed supportive. She attended the press conferences by his side, offering a picture of unity to the cameras. But in private, the cracks in their relationship began to show. "I didn't sign up for this," she said one night, her voice icy. They were in their penthouse, but the space suddenly felt cavernous and cold. "Do you know how humiliating it is to have my name dragged through this mess?" Jackson stared at her, incredulous. "Humiliating? Elena, I'm the one who's lost everything. Do you think I wanted this?" She crossed her arms. "Maybe you didn't. But you're not the man I thought you were. If you can't fix this, I don't know if I can stay." The words hit Jackson like a slap. He realized then that her love had always been conditional, tied to his wealth, his status, his ability to provide her with the life she'd dreamed of. And now that those things were slipping through his fingers, so was she. A week later, the fall was complete. The board of Harper Hotels voted to remove Jackson as CEO. His accounts were frozen pending investigation, leaving him unable to pay the mounting legal fees. He had no choice but to sell the penthouse, the cars, and anything else of value. Even Elena was gone, leaving behind only a curt note, "I hope you understand." One rainy afternoon, Jackson stood in the empty shell of what had once been his home, a suitcase by his side. The city outside the window seemed different now, indifferent, almost mocking. For the first time in years, he had nowhere to go. As he stepped into the elevator, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was from a news app, Trevor Reed spotted in Bahamas amidst embezzlement scandal. Jackson clenched his jaw, anger flaring within him. Trevor had taken everything: his company, his reputation, and years of friendship. But as the elevator descended, that anger gave way to something heavier, an unbearable emptiness. By the time he reached the lobby, Jackson made a decision. He needed to leave. Not just the building, but the city itself. There was nothing left for him here. With no plan, no destination, and only a fraction of his former wealth in cash, Jackson walked out into the rain and disappeared into the chaos of New York City. The man who had once ruled the world now had nothing. And for the first time in his life, Jackson Harper wondered what it meant to truly start over. The open road stretched endlessly before him, flanked by towering trees and patches of farmland that seemed untouched by time. Jackson Harper gripped the steering wheel of his aging rental car, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He had been driving south for days, avoiding major cities and steering clear of the highways. The solitude of the backroads was both unnerving and oddly soothing, offering him the time and space to think, something he hadn't done in years. The initial anger that had fueled his departure from New York was beginning to wane, replaced by a numbness he couldn't shake. For the first time in his life, there were no calls to answer, no meetings to prepare for, and no one relying on him. He was a man untethered, drifting through a world he no longer understood. On the fifth day of his aimless journey, Jackson found himself on a narrow stretch of road in the middle of nowhere, somewhere in North Carolina. The GPS on his phone had stopped working miles ago, and the fuel gauge was teetering dangerously close to empty. He cursed under his breath, scanning the horizon for any sign of civilization. Then it happened. A blur of movement darted across the road, a deer, its eyes wide with panic. Jackson slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the asphalt as the car swerved violently to the side. The next thing he knew, he was careening into a ditch, the car coming to a jarring halt as the airbag deployed with a deafening whoosh. For a moment, everything was silent except for the rapid thudding of his heart. Slowly, Jackson unbuckled his seatbelt and pushed the deflated airbag aside. The car was wedged awkwardly in the ditch, the front bumper crumpled and one tire deflated. He stepped out, wincing as he assessed the damage. It was clear he wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. "Great," he muttered, kicking the gravel in frustration. "Just great." The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the landscape. Jackson grabbed his phone, only to find that it had no signal. He leaned against the car, his mind racing. Should he wait for someone to pass by, or start walking? Before he could decide, the distant hum of an engine caught his attention. He turned to see an old pickup truck approaching, its headlights cutting through the dusk. The truck slowed as it neared, and the driver rolled down the window. A woman, her auburn hair tied back in a messy bun and her face framed by a pair of oversized sunglasses. "You all right there?" she called out, her southern accent warm and lilting. Jackson straightened, brushing dirt from his hands. "Not really. Hit a ditch trying to avoid a deer." She surveyed the scene, her lips twitching into a small smile. "Well, you sure did a number on that car." Jackson resisted the urge to roll his eyes. "Thanks for the observation. Any chance you know a tow truck nearby?" The woman hopped out of the truck, her boots crunching against the gravel. She was younger than he'd first thought, probably in her early 30s, dressed in faded jeans and a flannel shirt. "You're a long way from help out here," she said, circling the car. "Nearest garage is in Cedar Ridge, about 15 miles that way." Jackson sighed. "Fantastic. Guess I'll start walking." The woman tilted her head, studying him. "You don't exactly look like the hiking type." Jackson opened his mouth to protest, but she cut him off. "Tell you what, I can give you a lift into town. There's a little inn there where you can stay while they fix your car." He hesitated, his pride warring with his practicality. Finally, he nodded. "I'd appreciate that." The woman introduced herself as Ivy Bennett as they drove towards Cedar Ridge. Her truck smelled faintly of pine and leather, a comforting contrast to the chaos Jackson had left behind. She didn't ask too many questions, for which he was grateful, but her occasional glances in his direction suggested she was curious. "So," she said after a while, "what brings you to the middle of nowhere? Don't see many city folks around these parts." Jackson stared out the window, the faint outline of Cedar Ridge coming into view. "Just needed a change of scenery." Ivy raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. "Well, you picked the right place. Not much out here but trees, cows, and a few good people." The town was small, a single main street lined with mom-and-pop shops, a gas station, and a diner with a flickering neon sign. Ivy pulled up in front of a charming old house with a wooden sign that read Bennett's Inn. The front porch was adorned with flower boxes, and warm light spilled from the windows, making it look impossibly inviting. "This is my family's place," Ivy said as she parked. "I run it now." Jackson looked at her, surprised. "You own an inn?" "Something wrong with that?" she asked, a hint of amusement in her voice. "No, just didn't expect it." She shrugged. "People don't always turn out how you expect." Inside, the inn was even cozier than it looked. The air smelled of freshly baked cookies, and the walls were lined with old photographs and shelves of well-worn books. Ivy led him to the front desk and handed him a key. "Room 3, upstairs. Bathrooms at the end of the hall." "You hungry?" Jackson hesitated. "I don't have much cash on me." Ivy waved him off. "You can pay later. Dinner's at 7. As she disappeared into the kitchen, Jackson climbed the creaky staircase to his room. It was small but comfortable, with a quilted bedspread and a window overlooking the street. He sat on the edge of the bed, his shoulders sagging. For the first time in days, he felt a flicker of something he couldn't quite name. Relief, maybe. Or hope. Dinner was served in a cozy dining room with mismatched chairs and a long wooden table. Ivy brought out steaming bowls of chili and fresh cornbread, which Jackson devoured gratefully. A few other guests were seated at the table, chatting amiably, but Jackson kept to himself. Ivy, however, seemed to notice everything. "You don't talk much, do you?" she said as she poured him a second glass of sweet tea. Not lately, Jackson admitted. Well, she said, sliding into a chair across from him, you're welcome to stay as long as you need. But fair warning, this town has a way of getting under your skin. Jackson looked at her, surprised by the sincerity in her voice. He couldn't tell if it was a promise or a warning. Either way, he had no intention of staying long. This was just a pit stop, a place to catch his breath before figuring out what came next. But as the night wore on, Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that Cedar Ridge was more than a pit stop. It felt like the beginning of something new, something he couldn't quite define but couldn't ignore. The days in Cedar Ridge began to blur together. For someone like Jackson, accustomed to a relentless pace of business deals, board meetings, and social obligations, the quiet routine of small-town life was both unsettling and strangely comforting. Mornings started with the smell of coffee drifting through the inn, followed by Ivy's homemade breakfasts served in the cozy dining room. Jackson spent most of his days walking through the town, trying to make sense of what had happened to his life and wondering how he had ended up here. The townsfolk were friendly enough, though Jackson felt like an outsider. People would nod politely or greet him with a cautious hello, but their eyes lingered a second too long, as if trying to figure out his story. Cedar Ridge wasn't the kind of place where you could remain anonymous for long, and Jackson knew it was only a matter of time before someone started asking questions. One crisp morning, Jackson stepped out onto the inn's porch, coffee mug in hand, to find Ivy tending to the flower boxes. She was wearing a faded sweater and jeans, her auburn hair tied back in a loose ponytail. There was something calming about the way she moved, focused and unhurried, as if the rest of the world didn't exist. "You planning to help, or are you just going to stand there and watch?" she asked without looking up. Jackson smirked. "Not much of a gardener." "Well, there's a first time for everything," she said, handing him a small trowel. "Here, dig. It's therapeutic." Reluctantly, Jackson knelt beside her, digging into the cool soil. They worked in silence for a while, the only sounds the rustling of leaves and the distant hum of a lawnmower. Finally, Ivy spoke. "So, what's your story?" Jackson stiffened. "What do you mean?" Ivy leaned back on her heels, brushing dirt from her hands. "I mean, it's not every day someone like you shows up in Cedar Ridge. You're obviously not from around here, and you've got that man running from something vibe." Jackson hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "I had some issues in New York. Needed to get away for a while." Ivy studied him, her green eyes sharp but not unkind. "Fair enough. Everyone's got their reasons for starting over." She didn't press further, and Jackson was grateful. But her words lingered with him long after they'd finished the gardening. That evening, Jackson wandered into the diner on Main Street, hoping for a change from Ivy's cooking. The place was a snapshot of Americana: checkered tablecloths, a jukebox in the corner, and a waitress who greeted everyone by name. Jackson slid into a booth near the window, his mind still tangled with thoughts of his old life. As he sipped his coffee, a man entered the diner, his presence commanding attention. He was tall, with a lean build and a leather jacket that seemed out of place in the quaint town. His eyes scanned the room before landing on Jackson. The man approached with a slow, deliberate stride, pulling a chair up to Jackson's booth without waiting for an invitation. "You're new here," the man said, his voice low and even. Jackson set his coffee down. "That obvious?" The man smirked. "In a town like this? Yeah. Name's Eric. I know just about everyone in Cedar Ridge." Jackson introduced himself, though he kept the details vague. Eric leaned back in his chair, studying him. "Let me guess," Eric said. "Big city guy, probably ran into some trouble. Now you're hiding out here, hoping no one will notice." Jackson's jaw tightened. "I'm not hiding." "Sure you're not." Eric's smirk widened. "Just be careful. Small towns like this have long memories. Secrets don't stay buried for long." With that, Eric stood and walked away, leaving Jackson unsettled. Who was this guy, And why did he seem to know more than he let on? Over the next few days, Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. It wasn't paranoia, there were subtle signs. A shadow moving outside his window late at night. Footsteps on the gravel path behind the inn. He mentioned it to Ivy one morning, but she waved it off. Probably just the wind, she said, though her tone lacked conviction. But Jackson wasn't convinced. One evening, he decided to find out for himself. He stayed up late, sitting by the window in his room with the lights off. Hours passed, and just as he was about to give up, he saw it, a figure moving through the trees behind the inn. Jackson grabbed his jacket and slipped outside, careful not to make a sound. The night was cold and still, the air heavy with the scent of pine. Jackson followed the figure at a distance, his heart pounding. They moved quickly, weaving through the trees until they reached a small clearing. Jackson ducked behind a tree, watching as the figure met with someone else, a man. The two spoke in hushed tones, but Jackson couldn't make out the words. Then, the man handed something to the figure, a small package wrapped in brown paper. The exchange was quick, and soon the figure was retreating back toward the inn. Jackson waited until they were gone before stepping into the clearing. He crouched down, examining the spot where the package had changed hands. There was nothing left behind, but the encounter raised more questions than answers. Who was the figure, and what were they up to? The next morning, Jackson confronted Ivy. "Do you know anything about someone sneaking around the inn at night?" he asked. Ivy's expression flickered for a moment, then settled into a mask of indifference. "Why do you ask?" "I saw someone meeting with a man in the woods last night. It looked suspicious." Ivy's jaw tightened. "It's none of your business." Jackson frowned. "Ivy, if something's going on, I deserve to know. I'm staying here." She sighed, rubbing her temples. "Look, Cedar Ridge isn't as perfect as it seems. People have their problems, their secrets. Let it go." But Jackson couldn't let it go. He felt an inexplicable pull to uncover the truth, not just about the town but about Ivy. There was something she wasn't telling him, and it nagged at him like an itch he couldn't scratch. As the days turned into weeks, Jackson realized that Cedar Ridge was far more complex than it appeared. Beneath its quaint exterior lay a web of secrets and lies, and Jackson was starting to wonder if he was already caught in it. The air in Cedar Ridge was crisp, a blend of pine and wood smoke that Jackson had come to find oddly comforting. But beneath the tranquility of the town, he felt an undercurrent of tension, an unspoken weight that seemed to press on everyone he encountered. Ivy had been more guarded since their last conversation, her warmth giving way to moments of cold detachment. Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something from him, something bigger than a late-night meeting in the woods. Still, there was an undeniable pull between them. Ivy was the first person in years who treated Jackson like a person rather than a title. She didn't care about his past, or at least she pretended not to, and for that, Jackson was grateful. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jackson found himself sitting on the inn's front porch, nursing a bottle of beer. Ivy emerged from the house, a basket of laundry balanced on her hip. She hesitated when she saw him, then set the basket down and joined him on the steps. "Long day?" Jackson asked, offering her the bottle. She shook her head but smiled faintly. "Long week. Small-town life isn't as easy as it looks." Jackson chuckled. "Tell me about it. I thought New York was exhausting, but this place has its own kind of chaos." Ivy glanced at him, her expression softening. "It grows on you, though, if you let it." For a moment, they sat in silence, the sounds of the town fading into the background. Jackson wanted to ask her about the man in the woods, about the package, but he couldn't bring himself to ruin the peace of the moment. The next morning, Jackson decided to take a walk through town. As he passed the diner, he noticed Eric sitting at the counter, sipping coffee and chatting with the waitress. Jackson debated avoiding him, but curiosity won out. He stepped inside, the bell above the door jingling softly. Eric glanced over his shoulder and smirked. Well, look who decided to come out of hiding. Jackson slid onto the stool beside him. Figured I'd see what the locals do for fun. Fun? Eric laughed. You're about 20 years too late for that. The waitress set a cup of coffee in front of Jackson, and he took a sip before leaning closer to Eric. I want to ask you something. Eric raised an eyebrow. Shoot. What do you know about Ivy? The smirk disappeared from Eric's face, replaced by a guarded expression. He leaned back, crossing his arms. Why are you asking? Jackson hesitated. I feel like there's more to her than she lets on. I saw something the other night. Someone sneaking around the inn, meeting with a guy in the woods. She brushed it off, but I can tell she's hiding something. Eric stared at him for a long moment, then sighed. You're not wrong. Ivy's got her demons, just like the rest of us. But whatever she's mixed up in, it's not your fight. Jackson frowned. What do you mean? I mean, Eric said, his tone firm, if you're smart, you'll stay out of it. Cedar Ridge might look quiet, but this town has a way of eating people alive if they stick their noses where they don't belong. That evening, Jackson confronted Ivy again. She was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner, when he walked in. We need to talk, he said, his voice low. Ivy didn't look up. If this is about the rent, you're fine. Pay me when you can. It's not about the rent, Jackson said, stepping closer. It's about you. About what's going on here. Ivy froze, the knife still in her hand. I told you to let it go. I can't, Jackson said, his frustration bubbling to the surface. I'm trying to start over, Ivy. I'm trying to figure out who I am without everything I lost. And being here, it's helping. But I can't ignore what's right in front of me. I want to trust you, but you're not making it easy. Ivy set the knife down and turned to face him. Her expression was a mix of anger and sadness. You think you know me, Jackson? You don't. You don't know what I've been through, what I've had to do to keep this place running. So don't stand there and act like you have all the answers. Then tell me, Jackson said, his voice softening. Help me understand. For a moment, Ivy looked like she might. But then she shook her head, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I can't. Before Jackson could say another word, she walked out, leaving him alone in the kitchen. That night, Jackson couldn't sleep. Ivy's words echoed in his mind, and he couldn't shake the feeling that she was in some kind of trouble. He decided to take another walk, hoping the cool night air would clear his head. But as he stepped outside, he saw a figure moving near the edge of the woods. This time, he didn't hesitate. He followed, keeping his distance as the figure made its way to the same clearing as before. When Jackson got closer, he saw Ivy standing with the same man, her posture tense. They were arguing, their voices too low for him to hear. Then the man grabbed Ivy's arm, and Jackson's blood boiled. He stepped out of the shadows. Hey, let her go. The man turned, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. Ivy's eyes widened in shock. Jackson, what are you doing here? I could ask you the same thing, Jackson said, his gaze fixed on the man. Who is this? The man smirked, his grip on Ivy loosening. Just a friend. Like hell you are, Jackson snapped. Ivy, what's going on? Ivy stepped between them, her hands raised. Jackson, please, go back to the inn. This doesn't concern you. The hell it doesn't, Jackson said. If this guy's threatening you. Enough. Ivy's voice cracked, and the pain in her eyes stopped Jackson in his tracks. She turned to the man. Just go. The man gave Jackson one last look, then disappeared into the woods. Ivy stood there for a moment, her shoulders slumped, before turning to face Jackson. You shouldn't have followed me, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. And you shouldn't have to deal with this alone, Jackson said. Ivy, Whatever's going on, let me help you." Tears welled in her eyes, but she shook her head. "You don't understand. If you get involved, you'll get hurt." "Maybe I don't care," Jackson said. "Maybe I think you're worth the risk." For a long moment, Ivy didn't say anything. Then she turned and walked back toward the inn, leaving Jackson alone in the dark. The atmosphere in Cedar Ridge had shifted. Jackson could feel it. Conversations around town seemed quieter, eyes lingered on him longer, and even Ivy was colder. She avoided him at breakfast, kept her distance during the day, and retired early in the evenings. The warmth she once radiated had hardened into a shell, leaving Jackson to wonder what had finally cracked their fragile truce. But Jackson wasn't one to let things go. Not anymore. He'd already lost everything once: his career, his reputation, his friends. Losing Ivy felt like a line he wasn't willing to cross. If it meant understanding her pain, her secrets, and whatever danger lurked in the shadows of Cedar Ridge, then so be it. That evening, Jackson waited until the inn was quiet. He stood in the hall outside Ivy's room, hesitant for a moment before raising his fist to knock. The door opened before his hand could touch it. Ivy stood there, her hair loose, her face pale but determined. "I figured you'd come," she said, stepping aside to let him in. Jackson entered, the small room feeling impossibly intimate. A quilted bedspread lay neatly across the bed, and stacks of worn books lined the shelves. It was simple, but it was Ivy. "Talk to me," he said, his voice low. "No more walls. No more deflection. I need to know what's going on." Ivy crossed her arms, looking away. For a moment, Jackson thought she might shut him out again. But then she sighed and sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Fine," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "You want the truth? Here it is. My mom built this inn. It was her dream, her everything. When she passed, it became mine. But dreams don't pay the bills. Cedar Ridge might seem quaint, but it's barely holding on. Tourists stopped coming, businesses closed, and people started leaving." She paused, her eyes misty. "I tried to keep things afloat, but it wasn't enough. I took out loans, small ones at first, then bigger ones. I thought I could catch up, but—" "You couldn't," Jackson finished, his voice soft. She shook her head. "No. The man you saw in the woods, his name is Mitch. He's not a loan officer, not officially. He works for people who deal in other forms of credit. They don't care about payment plans or interest rates. They want their money, and they want it now." Jackson's jaw tightened. "And what happens if you don't pay?" Ivy looked away, her silence saying more than words ever could. The revelation hit Jackson like a punch to the gut. Ivy wasn't just struggling, she was trapped in a nightmare. And all he could think about was how much she'd hidden from him, how much pain she'd endured alone. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Why didn't you ask for help?" "From who?" Ivy snapped, standing abruptly. "From the bank? From the townspeople who barely have enough to survive themselves? Or from you, the guy who showed up here with nothing but a suitcase and a past he won't talk about?" Jackson flinched, but he didn't back down. "You don't know what I would have done. You didn't even give me a chance." Ivy's shoulders slumped, her anger fading into exhaustion. "Because I was scared, Jackson. Scared of letting someone in. Scared of hoping for something better. And scared that if I told you the truth, you'd leave." Her words hung in the air, heavy and raw. Jackson stepped closer, his voice soft but firm. "I'm not leaving, Ivy. Not now. Not ever." The next morning, Jackson knew what he had to do. He might not have the power or influence he once wielded, but he still had his instincts, his determination, and enough connections to make a difference. His first call was to an old colleague, a private investigator named Melanie Carter. Melanie had helped him on a few sticky situations back in New York, and if anyone could dig up dirt on Mitch and his operation, it was her. "Jackson Harper," Melanie said when she picked up. "Didn't think I'd hear from you again." "Yeah, well, life's full of surprises," Jackson replied. "I need your help." Melanie listened as Jackson explained the situation, her sharp mind piecing it together even as he spoke. "Mitch sounds like a mid-level player," she said. "Dangerous, sure, but not untouchable. I'll see what I can find." "Thanks, Melanie," Jackson said, relief washing over him. "I owe you." "You already did," she quipped. "But I'll add this to your tab." While Melanie worked her magic, Jackson spent the day with Ivy, refusing to let her push him away. They cleaned the inn together, repaired a broken window, and even managed to share a laugh over lunch. It was the closest they'd been since his arrival, and Jackson felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could weather this storm together. But that evening, the storm arrived. It started with a knock at the door. Jackson and Ivy were in the kitchen, finishing dinner, when the sound echoed through the inn. Ivy's face went pale, and Jackson knew immediately who it was. He followed her to the front door, his heart pounding as she opened it. Mitch stood on the porch, flanked by two men who looked more like bodyguards than associates. His smile was cold, his eyes sharp as they flicked between Ivy and Jackson. "Evening," Mitch said, his tone casual but menacing. "Hope I'm not interrupting." "What do you want?" Ivy asked, her voice steady despite the fear Jackson could see in her eyes. Mitch's smile widened. "You know what I want, Ivy. The deadline's passed. Time to pay up." "I just need a little more time," Ivy pleaded. "I'm working on it." Mitch's gaze shifted to Jackson, his smile turning into a sneer. "And who's this? Your new boyfriend? He doesn't look like much of a solution." Jackson stepped forward, his hands clenched into fists. "You've got what you want, your threats, your intimidation. Leave her alone." Mitch chuckled, a low, dangerous sound. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But guts don't pay the bills." Jackson's phone buzzed in his pocket, and he glanced at the screen. It was a text from Melanie. "Mitch has priors. Extortion. Assault. We've got him. Call me when you're clear." Relief and determination surged through Jackson as he met Mitch's gaze. "Actually, I think you're the one who's out of time." He held up the phone, showing Mitch the text. "You've got a record, Mitch. And I've got someone who's very interested in seeing it brought to light." Mitch's smile faltered, and Jackson pressed on. "You walk away now, and we forget this ever happened. Or you stick around, and we make sure you're answering to the law instead of calling the shots." For a moment, the porch was silent. Then Mitch sneered and stepped back. "You're making a mistake." "Get off my property," Ivy said, her voice stronger now. Mitch glared at her, then at Jackson, before turning and stalking off into the night. When the door closed, Ivy leaned against it, her hands shaking. Jackson moved to her side, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's over," he said softly. She looked up at him, tears in her eyes. "I don't know how to thank you." Jackson smiled. "We'll figure it out. Together." The days after Mitch's departure were a blur of relief and cautious optimism. Cedar Ridge felt lighter, as though a storm cloud had lifted, but Ivy and Jackson knew the battle wasn't entirely over. While Mitch was gone, the financial strain on the inn remained, and the threat of losing it still loomed large. Yet, something had changed between them. The walls Ivy had built around herself had started to crumble, and Jackson, for the first time in years, felt grounded in something real. Together, they began to rebuild, not just the inn, but themselves. One crisp morning, Jackson stood on the porch, sipping his coffee and staring out at the quiet street. The town had become home in ways he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't the kind of success he once chased, but it was better. Simpler, purer. Ivy stepped out, a notebook in hand. "You're up early," she said, joining him. "Couldn't sleep," Jackson admitted. "Too much on my mind." She raised an eyebrow. "Good or bad?" "Both," he said with a small smile. He gestured to the notebook. "What's that?" "Plans," Ivy said, flipping it open. "If we're going to save this place, we need to get creative. Events, marketing, maybe even a website." Jackson grinned. "A website? Who are you, and what have you done with Ivy Bennett?" She laughed, a sound that warmed him to his core. "Don't push your luck, Harper." He looked at her, his expression turning serious. "We'll figure it out, Ivy. I promise." Her smile softened. "I know we will." Over the next few weeks, Jackson threw himself into helping Ivy. He reached out to former contacts, leveraging his business acumen to secure small grants and attract curious visitors to Cedar Ridge. Ivy, in turn, poured her heart into the inn, restoring rooms, adding personal touches, and creating a space that felt as welcoming as she was. As the inn slowly came back to life, so did their bond. They spent their days working side by side and their evenings talking late into the night. Ivy shared stories of her mother and the inn's history, while Jackson opened up about his fall from grace and his struggles to find purpose. One night, as they sat on the porch under a canopy of stars, Ivy turned to Jackson. "I used to think losing the inn would be the worst thing that could ever happen to me," she said softly. "But now, I'm not so sure." Jackson looked at her, his heart pounding. "Why?" "Because it brought you here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Jackson leaned in, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Ivy," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I thought I'd lost everything. But meeting you, it made me realize what really matters. You gave me something I didn't know I was missing." Their lips met in a kiss that was soft and full of promise. For the first time in years, Jackson felt whole. Months later, the inn was thriving. Word had spread about its charm and history, and tourists were starting to trickle back into Cedar Ridge. The dining room buzzed with conversation, the guest book filled with glowing reviews, and the future felt bright. Jackson had no plans to leave. The life he'd once chased, the money, the power, the prestige, felt like a distant memory. In Ivy, he'd found something far more valuable: a partner, a purpose, and a love that made the past worth leaving behind. As they stood together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Ivy reached for Jackson's hand. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. "The life you had before?" Jackson thought for a moment, then shook his head. "No," he said, "because losing everything led me to you." She smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "You're a hopeless romantic, you know that?" "Maybe," he said, pressing a kiss to her hair. "But I'm your hopeless romantic." And as the stars began to twinkle above them, Jackson knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. Thank you so much for watching this story unfold. We hope you enjoyed this journey of redemption, love, and second chances. If you found the story inspiring or emotional, let us know in the comments below. What did you think of Jackson and Ivy's journey? Did you enjoy the twists and turns? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Also, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another story like this one. Your support means the world to us and helps us bring more heartfelt tales to life. Thank you for being part of our community, and we'll see you in the next story.